two ships are concerned, they'll probably repair those. That's not going to make a dent in the Russian arsenal, but it's a wake-up call, I think, more than anything else, for Moscow to understand they don't have anything left with which to attack us. They are in no position to stop us. We can crush them. What they're going to do now is turn to long-range strike weapons.
Who is?
The Ukrainians. They will launch whatever they can at Russian targets to create the illusion that there is still some fight in them. They have some capability. And the point is, if you're a Russian who lives in Russia right now, you're not very happy about having cities on your border pulverized by rockets and missiles. You're not happy about the drones that attack Moscow. And so the population in Russia is furious. It's enraged. And people say all the time, look, we like Vladimir Putin. He's done a good job. He's doing the right thing. But damn it, come on, Mr. Putin, let's end this attack.
So talking from a military perspective, what would the Russians have to do short of nuking Kiev to stop this war completely?
Well, I just told you what the Russian military leadership thinks, and that is that you've got to roll right up to the Dnieper River. You've got to cross it. You've got to go north to Kiev, and then you've got to go south into Odessa. Now, the Ukrainians know this. The Ukrainians are evacuating civilians from Kharkov. They are evacuating civilians from Kherson and parts of Odessa. So the Ukrainians are very obviously concerned that this is exactly what the Russians are going to do. But thus far, we've seen no evidence that they will. They can.
And we're talking, and every time you speak, they call you an agent of Putin. And I get it when I try to stop the war, and I have to answer with Hillary Clinton's famous statement, peace is patriotic. It stops them. The minute I say peace is patriotic, H. Clinton, they usually stop. Or I say, are you Zelensky's mouthpiece? Or are you a Zelensky stooge? I mean, he must have bots the way Trump does. That anyone says anything bad about Zelensky, you get 100,000 bots who call you every name under the sun.
Well, in Ukraine, you go to jail. Yeah, I don't think he or his friends can spell democracy. So let's drop that silly nonsense. That's a totally empty facade. Is running a Stalinist state, and he's losing what support he had in the population. I mean, most of the Ukrainians right now are sitting around in the West saying, what are we going to do? When are you going to end this? How do we get out of this? They have people guarding the borders with the West because they can't allow anybody else to leave the country, especially if you're a man who is an eligible military male for service in the Ukrainian armed forces. I think Ukraine is in a lot of trouble. I think Ukraine is on life support. The problem is we're keeping them alive. We're paying the bureaucracy. We're paying for the government. We're paying for the Ukrainian armed forces, what there is of it. Take that out, end that lifeline, and the whole place collapses.
Well, I accept 100% of what you're saying, but we know that the Uniparty will not stop the war. We know that the UN is right now in the UN. The Pope is even calling for support of Ukraine, not ending the war. The Pope, the man of peace, is calling for more war.
It's ridiculous. Well, I suppose since he's a Roman Catholic, there are Uniate Catholics in Western Ukraine. Not very many, but they're there. Perhaps that's part of his reasoning.
Should we be worried now about China? Because aren't China and Russia now somewhat closer as a result of this?
The Chinese are not pursuing us and causing provocations. We have been routinely moving through what we used to call the Formosa Straits, now the Taiwan Straits.
Taiwan Straits.
And technically under international law, those are Chinese waters.
Wow.
Now the Taiwan government has asked us to stop because they tell us privately, I'm talking about the Ministry of Defense, every time you send another surface battle group through there, the Chinese on the other side go crazy. And it takes, a couple of months for everybody to settle down to normalcy. But I keep telling people, and this is very important, the PLA, the Chinese Navy, has never stopped a commercial vessel. So they're not interrupting or disrupting the movement of commerce. Secondly, the claims that Beijing makes on the South China Sea are identical to the claims that are made by Taipei on Taiwan. They both make identical claims to the South China Sea. We attack publicly the Chinese in Beijing for that, and we ignore the fact that the Taiwanese are right there with them. This doesn't make any sense. Finally, the Chinese have 6 nuclear submarines, and they're not terribly reliable. The crews aren't as well trained as they need to be, and the Chinese government's very reluctant to let them travel very far from China. Now, the rest of their submarine fleet consists of diesel electrics. They're stuck in the coastal waters of China. Out of 300 Chinese vessels in the so-called Chinese Navy, over 100 are pure Coast Guard vessels. So what is this Chinese Navy capable of doing? Well, it's capable of sailing within a couple of hundred nautical miles of China, but they very rarely send anybody anywhere else. The Chinese are not a maritime nation. They never have been.
1,000 years ago, they were the leading maritime nation. Sorry, that, joking.
But, today, I think the Japanese Navy, if you set them loose, would probably sink the Chinese Navy in a couple of weeks.
Wow.
Everybody says, well, the Japanese are too weak. Their defenses aren't strong enough. Well, I have an answer for that problem. Leave Japan. And the Japanese will build whatever is required to ensure that China's influence ends at the beach.
You mean if we as Americans
Yes.
pull out of Japan, let Japan build up its own defense industry?
Yes, absolutely. When President Trump went to Japan, he spoke publicly and he came back and he said, this is a marvelous country. I admire Japan. I admire what they've achieved here. And they're extremely wealthy. The question I have is, why are we defending them? They can easily defend themselves. He was right.
Yeah, we need to get out of this business. They built some great weapons in World War II on their own, didn't they?
Of course. But the point is that there's no reason for hostility between ourselves and Japan. Of course, I don't see any reason for hostility between us and Russia. But my point is, we are running all over the world. We've got 800 bases. We've got over 100,000 troops and another 50, 60,000 Air Force and Navy all over the world. And what are we doing? We're bankrupting ourselves. We do not need to be everyone's defender. Most of the world can defend itself.
Roman Empire. You wrote last week, Colonel, in the American Conservative, that our unit party is eager to risk a war. We are ill-equipped to fight.
Yeah.
Why do you say America is ill-equipped? It's certainly not from equipment. It's from manpower, isn't it?
I would say it's both. Let's go through it. First of all, the U.S. Armed Forces today are still a magnificent tribute to the Second World War. They're organized the same way. They're prepared to fight that way. If you go back and listen to all of the luminaries in the U.S. military, the top generals and admirals, they talked about the coming Ukrainian counteroffensive and how it would be marvelously successful. You remember, you heard General Petraeus say these things and the others. And I remember Petraeus talking about, I think they've mastered combined arms. Well, Dr. Savage, combined arms is something the Germans invented and implemented in 1942. This is the 21st century. Warfare has changed dramatically. There's no understanding that right now, thanks to persistent surveillance from space and a whole host of terrestrial platforms, nothing can happen in Ukraine without the Russians knowing it. And if they can see everything, they can target everything. They can hit whatever they need to whenever they want to. This is a different environment from anything we've operated in. If I were going to compare it to something historically, I would tell you the Ukrainians are in the same position today as the German army was in the summer and fall of 1944. They couldn't move in the daylight. Remember? We had thousands of fighter aircraft. All of their Air Force assets were defending their cities. So the entire German army in the West was paralyzed, couldn't do anything. That's why we got the bulge. Remember? Bad weather, fool the Americans, and so forth. It was a long shot. It made no sense. They did it, just shortened the war, thankfully. But the bottom line is that's where the Ukrainians are. There's nothing they can do to defeat this force. Now, the Russians know it. But the point that the Russian generals at the top are making is very similar to what we just discussed.
It's a strategy. In addition to equipment, it's also the minds behind the use of the equipment.
Well, this is why we are not prepared to fight the Russians. And if we try to do it, we'll be defeated. There's more reasons. We talked about we're organized for a form of warfare that no longer exists. We're not organized to defeat what the Russian military is organized to execute. Which is ISR strike maneuver warfare. In other words, you have constant surveillance. Everything is linked almost automatically to strike assets, rockets, missiles, mortars, artillery, you name it. And you move your maneuver force on the ground within that framework, as well as integrated air defenses. We have no integrated air defenses. We can't stop a barrage of 200 or 300 or 400 missiles aimed at Europe. We have no means of stopping it. We can't protect our forces in the field. We don't have the air and missile defense that is needed. That's why the Ukrainians, whenever they get close to defensive belts, are targeted and annihilated.
They're targeted from satellite?
Yes, and also from other platforms. There are all sorts of platforms. Some are manned and some are unmanned. I mean, they have the equivalent of what we would call airborne warning and control. They have similar platforms that fly just behind their lines. So as soon as an aircraft takes off from an airfield in Ukraine, it's immediately sighted. And the word goes out, the aircraft is left. Now, the reason the missiles did the damage they did in Crimea is they fired 11 of these Storm Shadows.
Yeah.
Out of the 11, 8 were shot down. 3 punched through. And they were able to do some damage. The other element in this equation were some unmanned underwater systems. In other words, what we would call an underwater drone or a seaborne drone. Again, thanks to the British. Those things were launched and found their way into the harbor and did damage. You can't protect everything all the time, everywhere. You just don't have the assets. Nobody does. But we have none. This is the problem. We don't have anything. Not only are we not organized on the ground for this kind of warfare, we have no air and missile defense. So if we are to challenge the Russians in Western Ukraine, we're asking for an ass